Everything began innocuously. In January of 1956, Shirley awoke to find a silver key neatly placed on her pillow as if it had been placed there with great care. When Shirley had asked the family about the key, nobody had any idea of why it had been left there. Somebody had left it there, though, for her. Wally Hitchens tried the key on every door unlocked in the house, but still to no avail, it did not fit. And it was unclear what type of key it was or what it was intended to open. Now, at one point, the key just disappeared and nobody could find it anywhere. Initially, it was a little strange, but they just shrugged their shoulders and went about their day. That night, however, things began to take a dramatic turn for the weird. After everyone had gone to sleep that night, there was a scratching sound coming from the house's walls, which grew louder and louder as the night progressed. When Wally got up to investigate, he heard someone pounding on the walls and floor, so he just assumed it was rats, although I don't know how, but gradually the banging increased in volume and began to spread all throughout the house, rattling pictures and shaking furniture as it became a cavalcade of sound with lights flickering on and off. The battering, shaking, knocking, scraping, and screeching noises sounded like a symphony as they grew louder and louder until they reached a crescendo. The family was terrified and mystified at what was happening. Now, neighbors came from their houses to see what was happening since the disturbance was so intense. Then, just as abruptly as it had begun, the ceaseless banging and pounding ceased, leaving the spectators bewildered by a wall of relative calm. A check of the residence revealed no logical reasoning for the commotion, with everything seeming normal and no evident indication of a problem. Everyone ultimately returned to bed. Despite the strangeness of the event, the next morning, the police were informed about the previous night's disturbance and a surveyor was called in, but no reason could be identified. Even though these sounds had ceased for the time being, this was only the beginning of a terrifying ordeal. The banging and scratching noises had returned that evening, coming from the walls, the floor, the ceiling, and even from within the furniture itself. These strange noises had become commonplace, appearing out of nowhere and without warning at all day hours. This progressed to moving objects, with various items and furniture being carried, flung around, or knocked over by unseen hands, often as horrified witnesses watched. It was not uncommon for objects to float through the air or be hurled across the room, often with the apparent intent of hitting someone. Despite the tenacity and creepiness of the manifestations, they continued to increase, and to make matters more bizarre, things like slippers walking around on their own and clothing dancing everywhere was well observed, and pianos playing themselves, pens flying around and writing, and all of this progressing to some degree of violence. To make matters even more worse than they already are, they had often had objects hurled at them with great force, and in one instance, gloves even floating up into the air before being used to viciously strike Wally across the face, leaving red marks in their wake. Terrifying snarls of an animal growl could be heard from within the shadows. An unseen force almost pushed Ethel, the grandmother, to her own death. On one particular night, an unseen force had pulled Shirley out of her bed while she was still asleep and began wrapping sheets around her as if to entrap her. While shopping or at work, strange pounding and sounds would follow Shirley all around town as if she were attracting the attention of some unseen power. Then, these scissors and other office supplies began to disappear. Her boss mistakenly assumed she was playing a joke on him, and this eventually caught national media attention and even mentioned in the House of Commons, all having widely publicized the case now. Still, no one could develop a reasonable or rational explanation for any of it. The family had now given a name to the phantom, Donald. This even followed her to the BBC studios, where she was interviewed about this strange phenomenon. With letters, though, they were able to communicate with this entity in some way. At first, the spirit could only communicate by tapping on letters, but it soon progressed to writing messages on paper. At first, they couldn't understand it, and the notes were often illegible. "Viva France, go away, and surely I come," were some of the messages that could be deciphered from this correspondence, which also claimed to be the lost Dauphin, Louis Charles or Louis XVII of France, who'd been rumored to have escaped captivity during the French Revolution. Eventually, it began making demands and threatening to set fire to the house, which it did make happen. Donald had this strange, odd obsession with actor Jeremy Spencer, whom he insisted that Shirley meet. And when she refused because it was strange, he got upset and trashed the house, and uncannily, Spencer lost his life in a car accident not too long after this. As the paranormal activity continued in an erupt of violence, the family turned to psychics and exorcists anywhere and everywhere for help, but nothing worked. One day, Donald, out of the blue, left a note letting the family know he was going, and the entire 12-year ordeal had ended just like that. The house was then demolished in the late 1960s, and Shirley would move on to south of England to begin a new life. She would later return to the home as an 80-year-old grandmother and even wrote a book called The Poltergeist Prince of London. Shirley, later on, would write about how Donald began making strange demands around the house. For example, he wanted Shirley to wear her hair a certain way, and he threatened violence or burn the house down if she did not. Her dad was so paranoid that he hid all the matches and knives in the place and even locking them up. Fires would still start though despite this, and her dad even got burned pretty severely while putting one out. The wound was not only a nasty burn, but there was a significant gouge mark on his arm where it had happened. As bizarre as this entire account is, it's gone on to be one of the most infamous paranormal accounts in English legend. The Battersea poltergeist has baffled many and leaves us all wondering, was this an elaborate hoax, or did the family truly experience a living nightmare? It was suspected from the very beginning that Charles Morgan actually worked for the federal government as an aide to deal with crime organizations. However, that theory was propelled ever more into the territory of truth when the circumstances of his death grew more and more strange. From the outside, Charles Morgan seemed like a completely regular fellow. He was the head escrow agent at a statewide escrow in Tucson, Arizona. Now, a quick note about Arizona's laws. It's the only state that allows blind trust ownership of real estate. What this means, basically, is that any individual can buy a piece of real estate without being traced. Charles Morgan, an escrow agent, would be the only person that would know the identity of the person buying the real estate. He had children and a loving wife. From the outside, he was a pretty normal guy. And then, on March 22nd in 1977, Charles Morgan seemed to completely disappear. No one knew where this guy was or what had happened to him. Family and friends fear the worst when only several days later he burst through the door of his home. He looked rough, to say the least. Exhausted, beat up, dirty, and handcuffs clanging to his wrist and ankles. He hurriedly rummaged through the house looking for a pen and paper to write down the last few days of bizarre events. Because remember, nobody has seen him for a couple of days. And he noted on the paper that he was mute. He was beaten up, tortured, and then forced to ingest hallucinogenics to the point that he was unable to speak any longer. He was successful in escaping from those who held him captive somehow. His wife and children, astonished and heartbroken that he had even survived and made it back, pleaded with him to go to the police. Charles informed them that in doing so would be signing their death certificates. Whoever they were, if revealed, would target what Charles held most dear, his family. Charles urged that for all their safety, it was best they knew very little about what had happened and who they were that captured Charles. Now, after this event, Charles had tried his best to get his life back to normal, but it wasn't easy. He was constantly on edge with anxiety, refusing to ever let his daughters go outside by themselves. He even went as far as arranging for his daughters to be driven to and from school. He informed his family during this time that if anything at all were to happen to him, he would be sure to leave a note behind that explained everything, including names, organizations, people, places, all the sensitive information. Morgan did admit to working with the Treasury Department, which would link him to why he was captured. Now, going back to his job, it turns out he was doing escrow work for two separate organized crime families, the Ned Warren family and the Joe Bonanno family. It wasn't even 2 months later when Charles Morgan disappeared yet again. However, he would not be returning home this time around. On this morning, his wife would take the children to school while Morgan went off to go to work. His plans were not out of the ordinary. He had planned a Masonic meeting that evening. However, later in the afternoon, he had phoned his office downtown from a payphone and said he would be arriving at the office in 30 minutes. But Morgan never showed up to work after that. Now, fast forward to June 18th, 1977, Charles Morgan's body was found with his car on a dirt road in Sells, 40 miles west of his home. There was a bullet wound to the back of his head. Morgan was also wearing a bulletproof vest and even had a knife in his holster. he had been struck down with his own .357 Magnum, which was found nearby in his vehicle. The weapon lacked any fingerprints, and inside his car, the authorities would find a cache of ammunition, other miscellaneous items like a set of handcuffs, and a single tooth of Morgan's wrapped in a tissue paper, and also a pair of sunglasses that were not his. Upon investigating further, it was discovered that his car had been rigged so it could be unlocked by the front fender. The things they found continued to get more and more strange. Pinned to his underwear was a map of directions along with a $2 bill. And on the bill were Spanish names as well as a Bible verse, Ecclesiastes 12:1-8. The plot thickens because right before his body had been discovered, Ruth, his wife, received a bizarre phone call from a woman who referred to herself as Green Eyes. She told him, "Chuck is all right, and everything will be all right." Then she quoted the same Bible verse, Ecclesiastes 12:1-8, that was scribbled on the $2 bill found with Morgan's body. Police were successful in getting a hold of this mysterious woman and informed them that she had seen him after he disappeared, but right before he died. Now, according to Green Eyes, he showed her this briefcase full of cash that apparently was planning to buy off the hitman who had been hired to take out Charles. I guess the story is that Charles actually had a contract out for his life for 90 G's and was increasing by $5,000 every single day. Now, after carefully reviewing CCTV footage, police were able to confirm that Charles and this mysterious woman did in fact meet several times beforehand, but for what purpose, no one is for sure. They're pretty certain that it was not for an affair. Now, here's where it gets even more interesting. Following the death of Morgan, his attorney, Ronald J. Newman, had confirmed that Morgan actually testified in a secret state investigation where he worked with other high-profile individuals to testify about internal dealings at Banco where he was not involved. While his car had been impounded by the police, it was apparently broken into. His office where he had worked was also broken into and ransacked. And within weeks of his death, 2 men who were impersonating FBI agents showed up at the family home and searched. This case was eventually closed as it was believed Charles took his own life. The county officials spoke about his death, stating something along the lines of, they found nobody else involved in his death other than himself. But we all know how these things work out. If he was working as a secret agent, that would make him a target, or maybe his escrow business was just a money laundering ploy that had failed. Either way, it doesn't make sense that Morgan, who on the day of his death wore a bulletproof vest, and if he was to just take himself out. While the case is considered done, it's obvious there was definitely something being covered up. But what? Throughout history, there have been tales of something genuinely bizarre. A carnivorous plant that drinks the blood of humans. Deep in the darkest swamps of Nicaragua lies a vine that's just as frightening as it's described. While appearing more like an octopus in appearance, it feeds on the life force itself. They are known by the native tribes in the area as the Devil's Snare. The plant is widely known and feared by natives in the area. They all know well to stay away from it. Mr. Dunstan, a naturalist who had a one-on-one encounter with these vines while studying wildlife and plants in the area, detailed his horrifying account. He claimed that when he came face to face with this plant in the swamps of the region, he suddenly heard his dog emit a violent whine of pain as he was gathering some insect specimens. Running to his dog out of fear that something horrible had happened, he finds his dog bound and entangled in these gnarly roots and dark rope-like fibers. The fibrous rope appeared to excrete a black sort of gum from its pores with a terrible odor that was incredibly adhesive. The dog began to howl in pain as if whatever held onto it was slowly sucking the life out of his dog. Panic-stricken and moving quickly, he sets off fast to try and free the dog from these horrific vines. However, it's as if they appear to tighten around his dog. He tries hard to cut them with a knife, but fortunately, he was able to free himself and the dog, and he noticed his hands, where the vines had been, were all red and blistered. His dog did not escape pain-free, unfortunately. The dog, too, was covered in blood spots, and it seemed as if there were multiple splotches on its own body where it appeared to have blood drained out of it. The dog was highly disoriented and struggled to walk. He also described how the plant was tough to get off once it had latched on. Its grip was so firm that it tore flesh in doing so, and took a lot of effort to remove. Even today, there is very little known about the mysterious vampire vine of Nicaragua. While he tried to find more information on this mysterious vine, he could not. He found it very difficult to approach or handle properly, and that its suction capabilities proved very dangerous. As it turns out, there are actually other predatory vines like in the uncharted rainforest of Africa, where in 1852, a bizarre newspaper report spoke of it saying this, and I quote, "According to some Italian journalist, a new organized being has been discovered in the interior of Africa, which seems to form a direct link between vegetable and animal life. This singular production of nature has the shape of a spotted serpent. It drags itself along the ground. Instead of a head, it is flower-shaped like a bell, which contains a vicious liquid. Flies and other insects attracted by the smell of the juice enter the flower and are caught by this adhesive matter. The flower then closes and remains shut until the prisoners are bruised and transformed into bile. The indigestible portions, such as the head and the wings, are thrown up by these spiral openings. The vegetable serpent, as it is called, has a skin resembling leaves, a white, soft, fleshy portion, and instead of a bony skeleton, a cartilage-like frame filled out with yellow marrow. The natives, however, consider it a delicious food." Ben McDaniel dove into an underwater cave at Vortex Springs in Florida on August 18, 2010, and was never seen again. Ben just moved into his parents' beach condo in Santa Rosa, Florida, to escape his failed business and failed marriage. Ben's life hadn't been going so great lately, and he needed some time to think. So, doing what he loved to do, Ben turned to diving and found this perfect place, Vortex Springs. It's a very popular tourist destination and also great for vacationing, and it's only a few hours away from busy places like Orlando and Disney World. The spring is an enjoyable 68 degrees all year long, and thousands of people come there to camp and swim and, of course, dive. Ben went to the spring often, but he never got sufficient training to ever be considered a seasoned diver. The spring has a 200-foot basin that leads to a cave system underground. 13 divers here have died in the cave alone in the 1990s. As Ben dove into the Vortex Spring and descended to the bottom of the basin, it would be the last he ever saw of the surface. It wasn't until 2 days later, though, that anybody even noticed Ben's car was still sitting in the parking lot where it had been for the previous 2 days. While his disappearance was being looked into, the spring was shut off. Crime scene tape was tied from tree to tree, and there were no signs of his struggle in his car, and all of his things, including $1,000 in cash, were still intact. Divers sent by the police looked for Ben for days. They looked through the springs with flashlights, cadaver dogs picked up a scent on the bank of the spring, and one in the water, but when county health departments took samples of the water, they did not find any signs of an increase in bacteria caused by a dead body breaking down. Witnesses said they saw Ben on the evening of August 18th. He was going down toward the cave, which starts 300 feet from the cavern. A sign with a picture of the Grim Reaper is at the entrance to the cavern, and it tells divers that if they dive past that point, they will die. The sign reads, "Prevent your death. Go no farther. There's nothing worth dying for." Ben got to the cave's entrance, blocked by a locked gate. Only experienced divers had the key to the lock. Ben wasn't a skilled diver, so he didn't have the key. On the other hand, Eduardo Terran was a skilled diver who had worked at Vortex Spring. In the past few months, he had gotten to know Ben, and as he watched Ben try to open the gate, he got his key out of his pocket and opened the gate, and let Ben swim through. Ben was never seen again, though, after this, and Eduardo later passed a lie detector test to prove he was innocent. At the urging of Ben's parents, who had offered a reward for any information leading to their son's recovery, experienced divers continued their search for the spring of any sign of Ben over the following years. Even though the police had already searched the spring, some places they didn't want to look because they were too dangerous and they didn't have enough experience. Ed Sorensen, who actually owns a dive shop and is a skilled diver himself, looked through the spring very carefully. He would wriggle through tiny cracks that Ben, who's 6'1", would have been too big to fit through. He did this because he was determined to look into every nook and cranny of that cave system. Divers could not find Ben, but they did find 2 decompression tanks. Divers leave these as they go back up to the surface to avoid decompression sickness. It became clear that Ben had left these tanks behind. Now, aside from the 2 tanks, there was nothing else that could have been from Ben. A lot of divers are sure that Ben is not in the cave. As divers looked through the small passages, there was no sign of any human activity. There were no signs of aquatic scavengers looking for food, which you would expect if there was a dead body down there. and some people have theorized that Ben was murdered, which is of course a much darker explanation for what had happened to him. The McDaniel family hired a private investigator, Lynn Mary Carty. She came across some shady characters who were linked to the Vortex Spring during the course of her investigation. The former owner, Lowell Kelly, is accused of driving an ex-employee into the woods, accusing him of stealing money, and then viciously beating him with a bat. Kelly was the owner at the time of the alleged incident. The former worker was able to flee, but the ordeal left him so traumatized that he actually uprooted his entire family and vowed he would never go back to work there again. Now, on that same day that Ben was reported missing, a drunken Lowell showed up at the spring and inquired as to whether or not it was too late to go scuba diving. 2 years after Ben vanished for no apparent reason, Lowell also passed away under mysterious circumstances. He was found unresponsive after some head trauma in his home. Despite this, police did not investigate the incident as a homicide, much to the disappointment of Lynn Marie Carty. Now, several theories have arisen from this, and some claim he faked his death to go live a new life. Many speculate that he's actually still alive in Mexico living it up. After all, with a failed marriage and severe financial trouble, like owing the IRS thousands of dollars, it would make sense for him to throw away his old identity and use this diving incident as a scapegoat. However, Ben's family is confident that he would not do something so reckless and volatile. Unfortunately, there remains no closure for the McDaniel family, since the question goes unanswered. But more importantly, guys, what do you think? Let me know what you think down in the comments below. And as always, guys, if you enjoyed the video, be sure to go ahead and smack that like button. And if you're new to the channel and want to see more content just like this, be sure to go ahead and smack that subscribe button and keep your notifications turned on, because I release great content on the storytelling of mysterious and supernatural. As always, guys, I love you all. Keep an open mind, and I'll see you guys in tomorrow's video.